welcome to the Hennessy's House with me, your host, Nicole Hennessy. A lot of us have heard of this reality TV show, 19 and Counting, with the Duggar family that are part of the IBLP, and which is Basic Life Principles, and they're founded by Bill Gothard. But today we're going to take a different spin on this romanticized family and talk with Elizabeth, who was a member of that same community growing up, and how she overcame it and moved on and found herself in life. So, Elizabeth, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, super excited to sit down and chat with you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I really want to start out and talk about like how you found yourself in this situation and a little bit of your childhood. So could you share that part of your story with us?
Yeah, so I was born in North Carolina and I was removed from my biological parents' home when I was around 4 or 5 years old. And there was like a lot of relatives who were like competing to distribute the kids because I had two sisters and me. And we ended up in a foster home situation in Texas that we were taken to Texas and dropped off at a foster family there. And I lived with them until I was 9, and that was a very chaotic, awful situation. It was just not a good place to live. And then they did not want to keep me, so they were talking to multiple people, and just word got back to my parents that there was a family looking to get rid of a child. And so I was driven up from San Antonio to Dallas, and then I got dropped off at my parents' home when I was 9 years old, and that's how I moved in with my parents. So they had, I think, power of attorney. So there was like not a legal adoption. They just were given like power of attorney so they could do like medical doctor's appointments, all of that. But then I didn't get their last name until I was 20, and I legally changed my last name to theirs. And then they were in the ATI/IBLP Bill Gothard cult, which, as you mentioned, is like most famous from the Duggars. So they were very immersed in it, and they were very religious. They homeschooled all of us. We went to a home church, and we used all like ATI's, the wisdom booklets, which is the curriculum that Bill Gothard created, and did all like the basic seminars and the family camps and like all of the stuff that ATI families were supposed to do to raise their kids properly.
You grow up in an environment like that, and the amount of pressure that's put on a child to not make mistakes in general.
Yes. Yeah.
And, that's a lot. I mean, kids feel so guilty when they feel like they made their parents feel ashamed or upset. And we put so much, like, in general, pressure on ourselves as children that I
Mhm.
imagine that's tenfold
Oh,
in
yes.
in this
Yeah.
upbringing. So what were for you some of the out of the box, now that you're older and reflecting, right? Like out of the box rules and regulations that felt like almost impossible to always withhold?
So I remember when I was 13, my mom decided we should do all of our schoolwork with a pen instead of a pencil. And if we made more than like 3 mistakes writing in a pen on our like school paperwork, we had to start it all over again. So that was that, like every essay, every book report, it always felt like I was fighting to like make it perfect, or I'd have to start the paper completely all over again. And I remember I bargained to not have to do my math homework in a pen. I got to do math with a pencil. But that was just like weird, like ideas that my mom had that was very perfectionist. She used to say like, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. So, which is a verse from the Bible, but like has nothing to do with schoolwork. But for my mom, it was like everything in school had to be completely perfect, because of that Bible verse.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah,
yeah.
that's tough to, I mean, nobody's perfect.
Yes, nobody is perfect. That's absolutely right.
So to hold a child to that standard, my goodness, that's a lot of pressure. I mean, I know that you said you love to read, and I know that I saw you that the reading was very restricted, right?
Yes,
Media in
yeah.
general of any sort was very restricted in your upbringing. So what did that look like for you?
So my mom liked to read all of our books before we read them, but that I'm a voracious reader, so I read much more than my mom. But we used to read like an hour after lunch, and my mom would start books and then decide that they were like inappropriate. So we started Bridge to Terabithia, and then my mom was like, "Oh, the word he like said that it was hot as hell," and I remember my mom was like, "Well, we can't read this anymore." But I went and finished that book on my own. Like my mom did not know that I went and read that, and then we weren't allowed to read anything with romance in it. So I remember there was a Dear America Diary book that had it was on the Titanic, and the main character had a romance with this other like boy on the Titanic, and my mom stopped us from finishing that book because romance in it. And then as I got older, like any romance books, I was not allowed to read. So my mom, like a lot of our friends were reading like Pride and Prejudice or like Amish romances, and I was not allowed to like watch them or read them, which was very frustrating to me because a lot of my friends were like obsessed with the when Pride and Prejudice came out with the Keira Knightley movie, and like a lot of my friends were watching it, and I wasn't allowed to because it was a romance. um, and there was just like so many like different moral issues my parents would pick out in books. So like Felicity, the American Girl doll, she's like, I think in the first book, she's like in her independent nude and she's like doing things behind her parents' back. And so my parents decided that was rebellion and we couldn't read the Felicity doll. I could read like some of the other American Girl books. I read Kirsten and Ada, I think it was, but I wasn't allowed to read Felicity. And then definitely no Harry Potter. Anything that had like witchcraft in it, we weren't allowed to read. So anything that used magic. So my parents would prefer us never to watch Disney movies. I wasn't allowed to watch. I specifically remember I really wanted to watch Little Mermaid because I knew that was like a redhead, but I wasn't allowed to watch her because she was immodestly dressed. And my parents, that was like very taboo. So we weren't allowed to go to like when we would go on vacation, we would never go to the beach because people were dressed in, my parents would say people were dressed immodestly in swimsuits. So we were never that was like, yeah, we never visited the beach. But that's like a side thing that my parents were so strict about like where we went and what we were exposed to.
Yeah.
So not only with books, but like where we didn't go to any restaurant that served alcohol. If a restaurant like had a TV on, my parents would ask them to turn it off so that we didn't see the TV screen. Just like different things like that. It was just like they were just like very sheltering of us.
You mentioned your friends being able to watch this show and that you were jealous because you couldn't watch it. So, were you allowed to have friends outside of your religion?
Yeah, so we went to a home church, and the home church was like it was a collection of families that like met together on Sunday, and there was like different values and things. So different people believe different things about the Bible, but we like talking to my friends today who grew up in the home church, it was definitely a cult. Like they covered up a lot of abuse. They did a lot of wrong things in that church, but there were like different levels of strict. So some people were allowed to wear jeans, but they wouldn't wear them to church. They only would wear them at home. And then when I was 9 and first moved in, we never talked about movies we watched at church. So if a family watched a movie, they would tell their kids to never bring it up. But when we were like 16, 17, you know, you start to like as teenagers like talk more.
Yeah.
And we would compare notes like my parents let us watch Downton Abbey and then like I would like write down these stories. I was like, let me see if I can talk my parents into letting us watch this. Which Downton Abbey, we watched the first episode and then there was like a gay character in it. So my parents never let us watch any more of that. But that's a specific show. I remember someone saying, well, it's clean. So I like tried to talk my parents into letting us watch. But it was most everyone's parents were very strict, but there was like different levels of strict. And my parents were on the like most strict spectrum. Like we weren't allowed to do anything like play any games on Sunday. So like other people at church would like play volleyball or soccer, and we would never be allowed to do that because Sunday you were supposed to rest on Sunday. Because that was just like an idea my parents had from the Bible. And so people thought my parents were like the most strict of all the like families in that church.
Lucky you.
I know, right? Yeah.
Oh my goodness. So, okay, so you were allowed to have that probably made you feel like more questioning the rules and the boundaries, right? Because there were these different levels and you saw what other kids were able to do that you weren't.
You know, you would think it would, but it just made me want to know like everything my parents believed and be able to defend it because I didn't want to be judged for being weird. So I would be able to say, well, I'm not allowed to play with you on Sunday because this verse in the Bible says, you know, to not think your own thoughts or do your own works, but to honor only the Lord. So I would like be able to like defend the weird because I felt like kind of weird that I wasn't allowed to do these things.
Right.
So I was an apologist for my parents. Basically, I learned like the ups and downs of all of their thinking, and then was able to like argue with my friends and be like, well, I'm actually a good person, and you're the one that's weird because you're allowed to do those things.
That's very typical in any stance, don't you feel like? Like it doesn't matter if we're talking about politics or religion or anything that's debatable in life. It's like people automatically will go to defend, especially whatever they're being taught and raised in. Did you
Yes.
at the time in your life feel like 100% your parents were like doing right by you and like all these rules and regulations were how people should live and other people were doing it wrong?
I definitely thought that like my parents were good people and they were doing good for us, even things that were like child abuse tactics, I thought were fine. Like I was like, that's the parents God gave me, so I'm gonna do that. And then as I got older, like 18, 19, I just thought, well, when I have my own household and I'm married and I have kids, I'm not gonna do it the same way. But I would never like tell my parents you're wrong. It's just like we're gonna have differences. And I really just like knew that like I believed my friends were Christian and I thought they were good people, even if they disagreed with me. And as I like started to realize that I thought that, I was like, well, when I have my own household, I'm gonna be different from my parents and I'm still gonna be a good person. It's just gonna be different. And I just didn't think of it as like a huge, I wasn't going to be like like rebel from my parents. Like a lot of people were like, oh, you should, like I knew kids who had left home and like their parents were like, oh, they're in rebellion. Like that was, or like the story of the prodigal son who like leaves and like abandons his father, and like people constantly like were like, oh, my child is a prodigal. And I was like, well, I'm never going to be a prodigal. I'm never going to like go live in the world and do like my own thing. I'm going to stay like a Christian. I just will like live differently than my parents.
But here we are.
Yeah, I know. I don't know if they would call me a prodigal today. That's a actually they probably would, but like I had not thought of that. But yeah.
Mhm. So you said things that felt like that were like child abuse, but they were doing with this intent, like they were trying to teach you better. So
Mhm.
what did that look like for you? Can you give some examples?
So one of the biggest things, and my sisters and I like still like roll our eyes and like in frustration because my parents don't recognize it as like abuse or wrong, is so when I was adopted, I had PTSD from my previous home. So I would hoard food because like I was hungry all the time in my previous home and they didn't let us eat. So I would like in my new home, I would like go into the kitchen and take granola bars and like I think at one point my parents found 72 in the like dresser where I like would stuff them in the dresser and I would like eat them, but like I would hide food
Yeah.
as a response. Like that's a PTSD response.
Yeah, totally.
Um, and my dad was reading Corinthians and he was reading about Paul talking about like very immoral people in this city in the first century. And he said, you know, whose eyes are only on earthly things, whose God is their belly, who despise heavenly things. I think that is like the verse. But my dad was like, oh, my children, their God is their belly. It's not Jesus. They care more about food than they do anything else. So I'm going to make them eat only foods they dislike to like break this idol in their life. So then my dad would put us on like a cottage cheese diet, and we would only be allowed to eat cottage cheese, which I absolutely despise, for like a whole month at a time. And my sisters and
Like
I
that was
still,
all you ate?
yes,
No.
yes, yeah. My mom would like mix pineapple or applesauce in it, but it was basically just cottage cheese. Um,
Mm.
and my dad is like, did we really do that? And we're like, yes, you really did that. And it's still like very frustrating to my sisters and I that they don't recognize that that was like really bad. Because I would refuse to eat it. Like I would eat just to like not be like starving hungry, but I just do not like cottage cheese. So that kept happening when I was like 14, 15, 16, like all the way up to like I was 17 or 18 years old. That was like a common like threat that they would say, like, clean your room or we're going to put you on the cottage cheese diet, or like do your homework or we're going to do this. And it was just like a constant threat. And then I also have really bad vision. Like I wear contacts today, but I didn't get contacts till I was 20. So when I would like read books or whatnot that I wasn't supposed to, like I think like my mom would catch me reading when I was like supposed to be doing chores or doing homework. They would take my glasses, as like they would be like, you're blind in your sins and trespasses, which is a verse from the Bible, but they would like take that out of context and be like, well, we're going to physically make you blind because you're sinning. So yeah, that was not good at all. And actually, yeah, that, and then they at one point they tied a blindfold around our eye, like made us wear a blindfold. And I know two of my sisters and I, like one of my so there was I have two sisters. So one of us, Joy and I, they would duct tape our mouths shut when they decided that we were like not we were um like they would put us on restriction where we wouldn't be allowed to talk to anyone, and if we kept talking to people they would duct tape our mouths shut. And it was just like different things like that that they thought they were like, if you asked them today they would be like, well, we were frustrated, we didn't know what to do, so we went to these extremes, and they never like thought of it as like an abusive hard thing to do. They really just thought they were doing the best, like that they had, like the resources they had in raising us. When you adopt three kids who went through like a lot of trauma, those kids are going to have a lot of behaviors that are trauma related,
Yeah.
and that you can't like discipline out of a child. You have to give them like the resources, the emotional resources to cope. But instead of doing that, they tried to just discipline those behaviors away, and it did not work. So yeah, it just
No.
yeah.
I mean, if anything, it intensified those traumas, like being put on a cottage cheese diet when you already had these issues of feeling like afraid of where your next meal would come from.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure that intensified the trauma. And do you have any issues with like claustrophobia or anything? No.
Um, I don't think that's a good question. I don't think I do. I I I feel like I'm constantly like I do like I'm like a control freak in some ways, because like
Oh,
my
sure.
life was completely controlled by other people. Every
Oh, yeah.
decision was made by my parents. So now I like overthink everything, and like I've gone through therapy to like learn how to make decisions that like without like making everything a moral good or bad choice. Like, and I think the biggest thing I struggled with in college, and I went through therapy for this, is like actual eating disorders that is related to like my parents doing the cottage cheese diet, which I noticed my definitely my junior and senior year. Like, as I felt like when I was like in a class that was really hard and I felt like I was failing it, which I didn't. I had like a C or a B, but like I'm a perfectionist in many ways.
Well, you were
Um,
taught that you had to be.
yes, yeah. Um, and so like I would just like stop eating until I felt like I had studied enough to like get a good, better grade.
So you were like
And
self-disciplining.
yes, the self-discipline to an extreme. And I like actually had to like that freaked me out. I was like, wow, I've like lost weight, which is like I'm a small person. This isn't good for me. And like I had to go and sit in therapy and be like, I need to stop like using food as a reward for myself. Which I mean, my entire life, food was like my parents used it as a reward. Like be good and we'll let you eat a regular meal instead of cottage cheese. So like as an adult I have to like stop not view food as like crime and punishment in my life.
Yeah. So I'm like super extroverted. I can tell you are too, but the whole like duct taping your mouth or like blindfolds, I feel like that would cause for me like PTSD and like claustrophobia. Like I would feel
So
like being restrained or like hugged too tight by someone that I'm uncomfortable with or anything. Like I don't know, it would make me feel like ah.
I think it didn't for me, because when I was in the previous home, no, I was not allowed to talk to anyone ever. I like had to sit on a couch all day and like not talk to anyone. But for my sibling has told me that she feels extreme social anxiety because of how many times we would be go to church and my parents would be like, you're not allowed to talk to your friends because you're in trouble. And just like having to sit in church and not talk to anyone like has hurt. Like as an adult, she's like, this is like 10 years later, she's like, I struggle going out in social settings and feeling like I can talk to people, because of all. And like, I did not know that was an issue for her. Like, I knew we both went through like the same like punishments and trauma,
Yeah.
but for my sister, it's like, so it totally impacted her like in a worse way. For me, I just like I would write my journals, like everything I would say to my friends I would write in my journals, and so I like process not being allowed to talk to people.
Mm.
But my sister like that didn't know how to process it. But like it's totally, people totally relate to trauma differently, like totally
Oh
respond.
yeah.
Yeah, but like
Yeah.
from the claustrophobia and anxiety like has definitely shown up in her life, from those like traumas done.
Yeah. You bring up a good point though, because it doesn't matter what you're going through in life, but you could even just have like average Joe parents and
Yes.
siblings, and you're going to remember things and details differently than your siblings, and people are going to respond differently. to
Hmm.
those situations, right? Because we are all our own individual people at the end of the day. So the way we process stuff. And the fact that you said you journaled as a kiddo and you were able to process your feelings that way, like that's such a good tip for anybody that is feeling stuck in their current circumstances. So if anybody's younger or just kind of feeling like they're still trying to work out what's real and what's not and how they really feel about their current circumstances, people tell me all the time on the show that they journal. Like that seems
Yes,
to
yeah,
be such a great way. And it doesn't, so I've asked people like, how did you journal? I've seen you. So you had like a diary, right?
yes, yeah. Yeah, and
And
I was like an extremely extroverted person, so I literally wrote everything down in my diary. I was like, we had this for lunch, like from like, and I read it, and I was like, why did 15-year-old me think anybody would care what I ate for lunch? But I also wrote down like my sister and my mom argued for 2 hours today, and like I was extremely frustrated. Like I wrote down like what was so frustrating to me, and
yeah,
like it's really deep, like it's crazy detailed in a way. As an adult, I don't journal that detailed anymore, but like I was just like processing my feelings and my
yeah,
frustrations by writing literally everything down.
yeah. No, I mean, that's good because clearly, I mean, I didn't realize that your siblings were also adopted. So
Oh yeah.
all three of you were adopted. Were you all adopted? I'm using quotations. This is a podcast. That's silly. No one can see that. Um, adopted in a non-traditional sense.
Yeah, so they're my two biological siblings. So I
Oh,
was
okay.
adopted when I was 9, and then the foster parent who had us had said she would never let us live together. She didn't like me, and she liked my siblings, so she didn't want us to live in the same home. But they shopped, this is so sad, but they shopped my sisters around. They like went to different families and like would go on play dates and see if they would be willing to take my two sisters. And my two sisters are a year and 2 weeks apart. They're like twins. They were that close, and it's heartbreaking because people liked the younger one, but they didn't like my middle sister. So they would say, we'll take the younger one, but we won't take the middle child. And the foster mom didn't want to separate them because they were so close. And my parents were basically the only people willing to take all three of us. So when I was 12, so 3 years after I moved in with my parents, she drove up and dropped my sisters off, did not tell them that they were going to live with my parents, just told them you're visiting for the summer, and then drove away and never came back and picked them up. Um,
Also
so it,
traumatic.
so traumatic. And I didn't even realize. I was so happy to have my siblings in my life. I never realized that hurt them until we were adults. And it's one of those things that like in my mind, I was like, you didn't have to live with that evil person anymore. And they were like, but she was our mom. And they like she never said goodbye. And it was a totally different way to be given to my parents. And so like I was so happy to move in with my parents because the previous home was so abusive. But for my siblings, it was a much more traumatic transition.
Yeah. So, okay, I know with the foster care system in general, like if you want to become a foster parent or you want to adopt, there's courses you have to take, right? Like
Yes.
you have to
Yeah.
learn how to deal because like you said, you come with these pasts that are full of traumatic experiences and there is going to be rebellion. There's going to be acting out. There's going to be habits like hiding granola bars in your drawer.
Yes.
And there's appropriate ways to be taught how to handle these situations for the best of everybody. So is it safe to assume your parents didn't do any of this kind of like formal training
Yeah,
to
because we were not in the official Texas foster care system. And I'm still like, I still don't know what official foster care system we were in because we were passed from like around to relatives. And so the home we were in, they were a relative of us. But they took us away from North Carolina where we had like state custody, and they took us to Texas. So we don't know if we had stayed in North Carolina, if the foster care system would have like protected us from like what happened. Because you can't, like I was only 5 when I was taken from North Carolina. You won't ever have the answers to that. But when we were taken to Texas, we were under no state supervision, which is illegal. But like there's nothing you can do like now. Like that was in 2003. You can't fix it. So when we were given to Roy and Sharon, or like my parents did a lot of like self teaching. They like read books and whatnot, but because they were in the ATI cult, it was all filtered through that. So they would read things like don't spank your foster kids. So like don't do like physical, like spanking could be quickly viewed as physical abuse to a foster child because of what they've gone through. And my dad would say, well, the Bible says to spank your children, so I'm going to anyway because that's what the Bible says. So I'm going to ignore the like advice from professionals and do what I believe I'm called to do as a parent. So I know they read and they researched like how to help, like how to handle children who've been traumatized, but then they kind of threw all the advice out if they decided it wasn't what they were called to do biblically.
So, okay. I mean, that fair enough, I suppose, right? They're like, okay, well, here's some ground rules, but if they don't align with the way I interpret my belief system, then I'm going to throw that out the window and
Yes.
disagree with it. So it's okay to feed my kids only cottage cheese and duct tape their mouths shut and all of
Yes.
this
Yeah.
intense stuff. There
Yeah.
was an episode too I saw you talk about with some of the other rules in your house, like when you were doing the dishes and you weren't doing them right.
Oh, yeah, that's so when I was like 14 or 15, I was like really struggling to clean the dishes the way my mom wanted. And I still like to this day, I don't know if my mom was just mad and like, or if I was really not cleaning the dishes. I really have no idea. But she was so frustrated and she's like complaining to my dad. So my dad called me over and he made this sign on a lanyard. So it's like a 6 by 8 inch sign. And he wrote unclean on it. And he like made me wear this lanyard sign around my neck like everywhere. And in his mind, we've talked about this as an adult. I was like, "Can you believe you did this to me?" And he said, "Well, I thought it would like shame you, and you would start like doing your chores correctly, because you would be embarrassed to have this sign around your neck." And he said, "But because I was raised in foster care, and like I felt like I had gone through the most embarrassing like." I had like turned off my ability to be embarrassed. Like at a certain point, you're just like, life is so hard that you're just like, I can't make these people happy, so what's the point of trying? And I was at that point.
Well,
um
that might be a good thing for you because that
yes.
might like be part of how it was you were able to break apart from this,
Yeah.
right? It's because you're
Yeah.
like, you know what, screw everybody else. Like, you know,
Yes. Yeah, in a certain way, I'm like when I was at 17 or 18, I definitely was back to like trying to make them happy, but like 14 and 15, I was deeply depressed and I was like, there's nothing I can do to make them happy. And then I went to a retreat that was run by the cult when I was 16, and I kind of got like this spiritual reformation experience. And then I was like trying desperately to please my parents till I was like 19. And then at 19, I was like, I really just want to go to college and I really am tired of like being stuck at home when I know other 19-year-olds my age are not stuck at home. And like the people I grew up with in church are either married, which I didn't really want to do, or have left home and I want to leave home too.
yeah. Okay, so do you think that you at the time really wanted to go to college because you had these like life goals and wanted that education, or was part of it for you like I want I want to see what life is like outside of this home? What was your big push there?
I loved learning. I was a nerd. A self-admitted nerd, but I always felt like I wanted a traditional like school education where I had like the discipline of classes and learning from a teacher. So that was like my biggest motivation for college is I really just wanted to learn, and I didn't think of it as like escaping my parents at all. I knew that I would be able to be an adult and like get a driver's license and like be independent, but I still thought of myself as like I'm still a hunter. I'm still like I still live under my parents' roof as long as my like shipping address and billing address is their home address. And I didn't think of it as like leaving a cult. I just was like I'm just like going to school, and like eventually I will like have my own household and like get married and be my own person. But right now I'm just like in limbo between childhood and getting married. It's kind of like how I thought of college.
Okay. And I mean, there's a lot of added layers here, right? Because college and well, really, I mean, it was you and two females, right? It's three sisters. So the rules of this cult upbringing were very restrictive for females. Is that
Yes, yeah.
correct?
Yeah.
So,
And I don't think I mentioned this, but like by the time I left for college, my middle sister had left home. She ran away from home when she was 17. And then my younger sister was really like I helped her move to my brother's house. my parents' older son. So she moved to his house my freshman year. So like there was no one living at home when I left for college. I was the only child who like stayed with my parents until they were happy with how I left for college. They didn't feel like I rebelled against them. They were like, Elizabeth is doing her own thing, but she's doing it like with our like they weren't, I should say, they didn't think college was a good idea, but they were like, we can't stop you, so we're going to work around this, basically. And then once I was in school, like by my junior year, they were concerned like with the trajectory of my life, like what I was doing, like when I told them I applied to work at Disney and when it became
You're
very
not allowed to watch Disney movies, and you're like, I'm gonna go work at Disney.
yes. When it became pretty clear that I wasn't moving back home, they were like, maybe this wasn't the best plan for Elizabeth. So,
Okay, so why did your parents not want you to go to college?
um, well, they really just wanted me to like stay at home until I got married. And then when I applied for school, they were like, they really like, I didn't tell them I applied to my college until after I got accepted. And then they like argued with me for like a whole year because I got accepted in January and I didn't go till August. So basically, that entire 8 months, they tried to talk me into staying, doing it online and never going to campus, which I was like, that is not going to happen. I'm going to campus. And then they told me if I accepted federal funding, like from the FAFSA, that they would disown me. So my first semester, I paid completely out of pocket, which was like $12,000, like money I had saved since I was like 15. And then my second semester, I was out of money. And I was like, well, and I just accepted the federal funding and never told my parents, because if I had told them, they would have been extremely upset. So it was just better to not tell them that I took that money.
Why would they be so upset about that? Is it like, was that them using something as control to like kind of prevent you
Um,
from going, or was that?
they view any money from the federal government as a form of socialism. So like the stimulus checks that we all got, like from the COVID relief bills, my parents mailed them back to the government. They do not accept the money.
They could mail them to me.
I
If
know,
they, I'll
I
take
know,
it.
right?
Just cash
Yeah,
that and do a transfer, please.
yes.
That
But my dad like retired like 3 years ago, and like even though he worked for 40 years and like put money in Social Security, like required government money, like they tax it, he won't accept Social Security because
well,
he
more
thinks
for the
it's.
rest of us, I guess. I
I
don't know.
know it's frustrating for me because I'm like, y'all shouldn't. If you paid taxes all this time, you should go ahead and take the money. But
Yeah, I mean, it's your money,
yes, but my
but
dad is like,
it's
no.
you put that money there. Yeah. Wow. Okay, so you were expected to kind of stay home, get married, settle down, have a family. College wasn't really what your family had planned for you. Now, is this kind of in the sense of like that's what girls do? We get married young, have children, and stay at home and become housewives? Is that the
Oh, definitely, for sure.
did your parents grow up in this cult or did they join
No,
this together later?
no, they went to a basic seminar in the 80s that Bill Gothard was running. And I don't remember if their son had been born yet at that point or not. But my dad tells the story that he was working on a Sunday school bus, like working on like repairing this bus for his church's Sunday school. And the bus fell and it like fell on him and it broke his hip. He was like in the hospital. He almost died. Like they were like, you could be paralyzed. Like there was a lot of issues. And he says that he had just gone to a basic seminar and he was like, I don't agree with this. But after that, he was like, God disciplined me. The bus fell on me. And that's when I knew I was
Oh,
supposed to like be following. And so he tells that story and I like he really believes that like God wanted him to join ATI and like that by that bus falling on him like changed his mind. So
wow.
yeah.
I mean, I do believe in like signs from the universe for sure, but you got
Yes.
to be careful. I think
Yes.
sometimes, like sometimes
Yeah.
stuff just happens too.
Hmm.
So
For
know the
sure.
difference. Okay, so you decide to go off to college and you said that it was on good terms with your parents, but I know you've talked a little bit about like how your mom responded to you wanting to, which is, kind of what we're talking about here is like this belief system of,
Yeah. I mean, it was good terms as in they didn't think I was in rebellion. They were like, she's not a prodigal, but they still used a lot of manipulation and gaslighting to like convince me that I was in the wrong. So like for my whole freshman first semester, my mom would call me at least once a week and tell me that she thought I was outside of God's will. And then when I changed my major from education to journalism, they were not, they wanted me to be an education major so that I could like homeschool my children. And so that was like
Mm.
within their like ideas of what a woman should study. And then I switched to journalism, and they were not a big fans of that, kind of very belittled my ideas.
I mean, that
And
makes sense to me. Like you were very restricted on what you were allowed to read, but you loved reading and you weren't allowed to watch all these certain shows. So the idea of journalism was probably very like, whoa, you can't.
yes, yeah. And then I told them that I wanted to write for a news magazine that they got every week, which was World Magazine, which is like a Christian Time magazine. So at that time, I was like, I'll work for World. And they were like, well, World Magazine is good. And then I switched, like, by my first semester in journalism, I was like, no, I like writing, but I actually want to work in TV. But I just kind of didn't tell them that for like 2 years. So they continued to think I was going to get work for World Magazine, and I just like stayed in
Yeah.
taking TV classes. So
As a-
it was difficult because a lot of people like talk to their parents about college, and you like talk about your classes. I would only tell my parents if I got A's. Like I would say I got an A in this class. I would never tell them if I got anything below an A, because they would answer, well, if you if I was like, oh, I got a C on my French test. I hated French. Me and French didn't get along. My parents would be like, well, if you would um have studied more, like I could have studied like 15 hours, and my parents would say, well, whatever your hand finds to do it with all your might. So if you're getting C's, that means you're not doing school with all your might, so you're somehow like like disobeying God. Like in different, like the response was always negative if I got anything below an A. So whatever classes, I only told them if I got A's, and then I only shared classes that I thought they would like that I was taking. So Bible classes or philosophy. When I was taking all my TV media classes, I never told them about those things. If I had any trouble like at school with like when I got in trouble my senior year and for my sexuality and stuff, I never told my parents that. They never had any idea. It was just like my schooling experience was like very filtered, and like so that they continue to have a pretty positive view of me at college.
yeah. So, I mean, you definitely had to filter the conversations you had with them, but you still held on to this relationship with them. You still do, right? You're still,
Yeah, I have
eh,
we have a we have a relationship, which a lot of people find like really strange. But when you I have always felt like I chose them as my parents, like when I was 10 and I started calling them mom and dad. And it's really hard to let go of someone who has been a part of your life for like 15
absolutely.
years.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and like I will disagree with them about multiple things, but as long as we can disagree and like they don't use that to manipulate and gaslight me, and like I've created those boundaries that they
Mm.
know if they cross, like you can't talk to me about this, you can't like tell me these kind of things. And like I have only learned to make those boundaries through therapy. Like if I had not gone through therapy and like had a therapist say that's gaslighting, that's a boundary that you need to
Yeah.
make, and you need to not let your parents talk to you about this, then I wouldn't be able to have a relationship with them.
Okay, so that was one of my questions is like when you said that they were like using manipulation and gaslighting, at the time you weren't aware of that, correct? It
Yeah,
wasn't
I
like
had
this is gaslighting. You were like,
yes, definitely
I'm
not.
did you
Yeah.
question yourself? Like, were you like, oh my gosh, I'm going to hell for the life that I'm choosing to live here? Did you go through a phase like that?
Um, I don't think I ever thought I was going to hell. I was like, am I not right with God? Am I really a bad person?
Yeah.
And I definitely thought like I had, but I also didn't feel that I was not right with God. I was like, I don't feel messed up for this. Like I don't
Good.
feel
Yeah.
emotionally disconnected from God. So I think my parents are wrong. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay, so this is really good because I feel like what we're talking about here is like you have like natural grit, right?
Yes.
Have you
Yeah.
like been told this? So like to me,
yes.
that's the vibe I get from you is like you're somebody who has natural grit. Now, grit doesn't have to naturally come to a person, right? Like some of us develop that circumstantially and others never have it and some are born with it. And you were able to have this ability where you're still able to maintain a relationship with your parents, but still be true to yourself. And I mean, we'll get into this if you're comfortable with it, but like you have so many layers. Like, I mean, not only did you go with journalism, not only do you work for television and leave this cult experience, change religions, you're also a lesbian, correct?
Yes.
Which is
Yeah.
so there's so many layers of like who you are today that go against the belief system that you were raised in.
Hmm.
And you still are able to maintain some kind of relationship with them. And I
Yes.
could see
Yeah.
how people would tell you, like, that's crazy. I can't believe you even talk to them. But like, if you don't live in an environment like that, you really don't have room to talk on it because these are your parents at the end of the day.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And you know, I'm close with mine, but there's definitely things in my life that I say they didn't do right. And I don't agree with them. However, I feel like they were doing the best they could with the knowledge they had.
Hmm.
And our relationship is different now and we're really close. So, you know,
Yeah.
I
And I have a lot of grace for them because they really believe like that they are right with God. And if they didn't, if they've they've really struggled. I watched my dad really struggle when my brother had grandchildren, and my brother didn't have grandchildren. When his grandchildren, when
yeah.
my brother had kids and he had grandchildren, and my dad really struggled, like, to think, how do I develop a relationship with him, because he didn't approve of their lifestyle, because my brother was never one to like accept the like rules, and my sister-in-law was definitely not one. So I remember like when his my dad's grandkids like started, listening to contemporary music and watching Disney movies and like wearing normal clothes instead of like very like the ultra modest clothes that like they grew up like my dad believes was right. My dad was like, do I choose my grandchildren, and or do I choose my beliefs first? And I watched him like really, really struggle with that. And I was just like flabbergasted, because in my opinion, like in my life, it's always like relationships kind of matter more than like your personal convictions. But for my dad, it's always been convictions over relationships. And so I watched him like try to figure out who he was if he put relationships first. And he didn't like the person he was when he put relationships first, because he felt like he was compromising his convictions. And I have a lot of empathy for that, because I don't like seeing him torn up emotionally because he feels like his convictions aren't being held. So when it comes to like my relationship with him, I don't ask them to sacrifice their convictions. I'm like, if it makes you uncomfortable to like talk to me because of my sexual identity, like my dating, then I'm not gonna ask you to come to my wedding. I'm not gonna ask you to support me in this way, because I don't want you to feel like you're not yourself. Because they hold these convictions very like those convictions matter to them in the way that my personal beliefs matter. And like I can't sacrifice my personal beliefs to like appease them, and I can't ask them to sacrifice their beliefs to like
Oh,
further our relationship.
that's huge. I hope you know that because it's so easy to be like, you guys are crazy and like you're my parents and if I get married you better be there and if not like poor me. And I don't mean you're not being poor me, but it would be so easy for you to have like a victim mentality in your entire childhood, right?
Oh my goodness. Well, I mean,
Like
there were days I feel really sorry for myself. Like when
well, of course we all
yeah,
have
yeah.
days like that, but like you really went a whole different route with this and let yourself find such incredible like wisdom and strength instead of falling into a position of victim mentality, which I'm not trying to knock victim mentality because it is with good reason there for
Hmm.
people. Like
Yeah.
this isn't like, oh, I don't mean it in like a derogatory way, right? Like I'm just saying that we all have control over how things affect our lives. And you decided that. You decided, like, you know what? Either I'm going to let this control me or I'm going to control it. And you
Yeah.
controlled it.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
used it to your
And that
advantage.
I definitely didn't get to that point without a lot of therapy and like developing
Of
like
course.
good like relationships in my life, like good friends who like have really come alongside me and supported me in many ways. Um, yeah, and I mean, it takes a lot of emotional labor to get to that point in your life.
Oh yeah, it really does. And the work is not easy work. And sometimes it brings out memories that you didn't even remember you had. And like, I mean, there's a lot to it. I think therapy, I mean, I have a therapist. I love therapy. She recently told me we should go to once a month. And I was like, no, that's not gonna I love you. I need you in my life. Um, yeah, no, I 100% agree with you that therapy is amazing. And it does take time and work, but the first piece of it was acknowledgement, right? For
Yes,
you, it's
yeah.
like things
I
don't
feel
align with me, right? And I need to work through this.
Yeah, I started going to therapy my second semester freshman year, and it was because my roommate was like, Elizabeth, really struggling to was being stalked by like various guys on my college campus because I didn't know how to set up boundaries. So these guys would like follow me between classes and whatnot, and I would be like, I'm not interested in you, and they would still continue to like message me and like follow me and like just be a bother. And my roommate said, I will go with you to your therapist. Like I will go physically and sit there with you. If you want to like talk, like you need to talk through this, like learning how to say no to people and not feeling like so tremendously a victim or like feeling guilty over this. And it was also like my relationship with my parents. Like my roommate is witnessing me like weekly turn into like a child basically on the phone with my parents and like
Mhm.
completely being walked all over by my mom's like religious like you need to do this, you're not going to church on Wednesday night and Sunday night, and like my mom scolding me for that and me like not like just quietly sitting there listening to my mom lecture me for like hours at a time. So my roommate basically like is a hero
I
because
was
I
about
would
to say that. Like, what a
yeah.
blessing that you had somebody that cared enough about you as a person to help you identify that.
Yes, yeah. So like I walk into the therapist's office and my friend would just like sit there and she was like super supportive because she would hear what the therapist would give me for advice and I would be able like to continue to process that and then like go out to lunch with her and be like, so the therapist told me this, like do you see me like how do you like, and get her opinion and like her like daily like living with me and helping me find like put into practice what my therapist was like helping me with. So yeah.
That is amazing. Don't we all need a friend like that?
Yes, yeah.
We
Yeah. You
unfortunately
find a friend
we
like that, keep them.
keep them around for life. Yeah. No, I think that is amazing. And for anybody who doesn't have a friend like that, like we're gonna be that friend for a minute. Like go get yourself therapy, work through this stuff. It's in you. You can do this. So when you started this journey of like, this isn't the life I want, and you started to realize like your sexuality and this piece of it, I mean, that had to be huge.
Yes, yeah.
I because I mean, you've said a few times that there was things in like books and stuff that you weren't allowed to read because it referred to like a same-sex couple.
Yes, yeah.
So I'm assuming there was very strict boundaries around the LGBTQ community in your upbringing.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I had just like my dad used to tell us that like gay people exist because men shave their beards and women wear pants. So like that was like all I knew about like LGBTQ identity or community. And like my dad's opinion of Stonewall was so negative. Like it took until this last summer, I listened to like a 4-hour podcast on Stonewall and like the history of it. And I was like, oh, that's actually what happened. Because like I only heard negative, very awful things about the LGBTQ community, like the fact like the AIDS epidemic was like heavily emphasized. And like I was basically told
Mm.
any gay people who choose to be gay, um, God gives them AIDS as like a punishment, which is like a horrific thing to tell someone. And
Right.
then I definitely was told that AIDS and alcoholism were similar in that like you could have a genetic disposition towards alcoholism. And as like an Irish American, like I understand that because like all of my Irish biological family is like very, they drank alcohol and they're like mostly alcoholics and addicts. So like I understand like my parents talking to me through that
Girl,
to
my
try
last
to
name is Hennessy.
yes,
So
yeah. Yeah, well mine was Haithcock and Hinnett before I was like I changed my name, and like they're all like very Irish, Scott Irish.
yeah.
Um and so my parents were always like, don't ever taste alcohol because you're Irish, you'll become an alcoholic. That was like the
Mm.
constant, and the same thing with like LGBTQ identity. My dad was like, if there's a genetic disposition towards like being gay, it's like the same as being an alcoholic and you can choose to not be gay. just like you can choose to not be an alcoholic. And so that's like the only understanding of sexuality I have when I'm like 21. And then I started to realize I was gay when I was like 23, and like had to like work through like the natural like stigma that I had towards the LGBTQ community that was like extremely negative because of all the like very negative things I had been told like growing up.
Yeah. What was sex education like for you?
It was non-existent. There was no
Like
sex
totally, yeah.
education. No.
I was curious about that. I actually have a podcast episode coming out all about sex education, like
Yeah.
talking with somebody about like different stages in
No.
life and
My
stuff.
I remember I asked my mom something and she told me, "Well, I'll tell it all to you like the night before your wedding." And I was like, I don't want that conversation the night before I get married, but like whatever. Like that, but that was my mom's thought. Like, you will need to know it all like the night before you get married, and until then, you don't need to know anything.
Okay. So I mean, so it makes sense that like you were questioning your sexuality at 23 and you hadn't like really figured this out earlier because like there is no sex education. You probably were not allowed to date. Is that
That's exactly right. Yeah.
okay? So even when you left and went to college, were you dating at all?
Um, I went on a couple dates with guys at school, but it was
Mhm.
like my school was very conservative, so it was
Yeah.
just like sitting at Chick-fil-A and talking. There was that
Okay.
was the extent of it, and it like never went beyond like a first date. I just never clicked with guys for obvious reasons now,
Yeah.
but like it just didn't click. Up until I was 22, 23, like my entire life, I was in survival mode, like just trying to like get my basic necessities like food, emotional support, like fighting to like be alive and like continue to like not be emotionally overstressed. So I really didn't have the space to like breathe and
Yeah.
experience like any like not like relaxation till I was like 22 or 23. So it like makes sense that I like didn't realize my like sexuality till then because I was
Yeah.
like just trying to survive.
Yeah.
And then I was a junior and then like I had like all semester this guy and I had like been talking, and I didn't like him, but like people kept like being like, "Oh, you and this dude would be like so cute together," and I was like, "Would we?" Like, if you say so. And then it would like at the end of the semester, I was like, "This was extremely frustrating," and I disagreed with this guy so many issues, like social issues, and I was like becoming more liberal, and he was like extremely conservative. And I was listening to podcasts by like LGBTQ creators, um, because my school was so conservative, I was like looking for non-conservative voices. So I was like listening to these podcasts.
Yeah.
And as they were like talking about sexual identity and like their feelings and before they realized they were like before they came out of the closet, and as they like shared those like emotional journeys, I was like, that's where I am. Like it just dawned on me. I was in that like exact like frustrated, feeling unfulfilled, like feeling like unseen, like nobody understood me, and like feeling like just troubled about like trying to like guys and trying to be a straight like person. And like as I'm hearing this person like describe that before they came out, I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm in that same moment. And that is basically like what led me to go, well, maybe I am not straight. Like, what does it mean to even be straight? And I was like, well, I've never experienced any of the things. So like
Yeah.
mean like that I'm attracted to men, and so I was like, well, what did if I was queer, what would that look like? And I was like, oh, it would look like all of these things. And I was like, oh, I guess I am then because I have experienced all of those things. So
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot more to your preferred sexuality than sex.
yes,
Like, right?
exactly.
It's
Yeah.
and I think that's the thing that like is a holdup for a lot of people, right? It's like it's not
Hmm.
just about your sexual attraction. It's like what resonates with you, who makes you feel whole, like, and like
Yes, the emotional
right?
connection
Yeah.
is like so different.
It is so much deeper than just sex. It
Yes.
really
Yeah.
is. I mean, and how can anybody ever argue that when you grow up in an environment where you're not supposed to have sex until you get married?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's the same. Like how can you say that you're straight if you've never had
Yes.
sex,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's the same.
I
Oh,
totally I totally agree. And like for me, like discovering my sexual identity was totally outside of sexual like activity because I realized I was gay without ever like going on a date with a girl or
yeah.
like having sex with anyone. And just because of the environment I was in. And like it makes me extremely frustrated when like being a lesbian is in being gay is like people automatically think, who are you having sex with, instead of
Right.
like the other like aspects of my identity, which is so much like it's so much more broad and like diverse, and it's not just about like the intimacy, like
Yeah.
sexual intimacy. Like that's like, it's just very frustrated that that's what it like people in their minds like narrow it down to, especially in evangelical circles and who I grew up with, because it's like if you're having sex, that makes you're like immoral, or they just want to lump it in with like anything they
Yeah.
yeah.
No, I feel you. I mean, and here's the thing. When you start dating, typically, if you don't grow up in a cult where you don't date, when you
Yes.
start dating, you're not having sex right away.
Yeah,
You're just
exactly.
you're holding hands with a boy at the football game, or
Hmm.
you're waiting for someone to text you back and like excited
Yes.
and
Yeah.
going to the movies. This is dating. So if you can do that and claim like I know I like boys as a girl because I like doing these things with boys and not girls, then you can say the same if you like girls and you're a girl, or a boy and you're a boy.
Yes. Yeah.
You know? And you're right, there is such a, culture around the sexuality of the LGBTQ community that I feel that's gotta be the next thing. That's not there yet. Like, we're becoming more aware and more supportive of LGBTQ community, and we're seeing it more in media, and, like, I
Hmm.
love
Yes.
that. I think that's fantastic. But hopefully we get to a point where we can separate sex from sexuality.
Yeah. And I look forward to that day, like when JoJo Siwa came out, and
Mhm.
like everybody was like, "Well, this is inappropriate for children," and it's like, no, you're the one who's sexualizing this. Like JoJo Siwa coming out doesn't automatically make it about sex. It's like
Not
her
at all.
identity is so much bigger than that, and so I saw that like same conversation, and I think as people like JoJo Siwa, who has a child-centered audience and who is completely herself, and like it doesn't make it. It's not like a Miley Cyrus twerking on the stage, like how
No.
child stars like that's not what it is about. And
Not at all. My
and
daughter,
like
my 10-year-old loves JoJo Siwa, by the way. Like,
yeah,
she's loved her
yes,
for years. And I was like super excited for her to have that influence in her life. Like, I was like, that's awesome
yes,
that she
yeah,
gets to see this.
it's amazing. Like it's an incredible role model because it's still child friendly, and it's still like totally normalizing it, which is really beautiful to see. And it's something that like child and I like look back on me as a child, I would have really like appreciated that.
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully it would generate the next generation. We see more of that. So when you came out to your parents, we talked about how you still have a relationship with them, and you talked a little bit about boundaries.
Hmm.
So I'm assuming your sexuality was put into place as a boundary with them.
Yes.
And I would love for you to tell me what the biggest boundaries are between you and your parents, and what that was like for you to set them,
Hmm.
and what that looked like, because I think a lot of people struggle with setting boundaries, especially with their parents.
Yeah. So I had gone to my therapist and I said, I want to come out to my parents and I want to stop being frustrated at my parents for really annoying things. And the frustrating things were related to religion and politics and just like conversations like that.
Yeah.
And my dad and I have my dad is very philosophical. He's like a very like deep thinker, and my mom is not a deep thinker. And I can talk to my dad about things like the Black Lives Matter movement, totally different than my mom. And with my dad, it's like he is completely colorblind. So he would just say like he's never seen racism, like he's never been racist. So I could talk about systemic racism and like what that means and what that looks like. And we have a really like educational conversation. And I kind of learned from him and like his perspective, having grown up in like a completely different culture.
Yeah.
Like he grew up in New Mexico, completely different culture than where I live in the South.
Yeah.
And but with my mom, it just becomes very xenophobic very fast, and just like becomes like very polarized, like kind of like a Facebook conversation. And that was becoming increasingly frustrating for me. And so I went to my therapist. I was like, I want to continue having conversations with my parents, but I end up just like being mad, and I'm tired of being mad. And I was like, and I also want to come out to my parents. And my therapist is like, well, you need to sit down and like figure out what makes you emotionally frustrated and like set boundaries so you don't get there. So I kind of sat down with my parents and I was like, I really like talking about politics is like something I love to chat about. I love to talk about religion with people, but when I do it with y'all, it just ends up being like I feel like I'm talking in circles some of the times. And y'all are upset that I'm no longer in church. So I feel like it would be really great if we just make a rule that we won't talk about religion and politics on like unless we like agree to not argue about it. And you can hear my perspective, but for sometimes I don't want like I want sometimes I want to share my perspective with them, but I also it's really hard for me to hear my mom's perspective because it's literally just like she's not a QAnon person, but she just whatever she saw on Facebook. So like with the Capitol incident on January 6th, my mom's perspective on that was like it was left-wing agitators who like dressed up like Trump supporters. And like this is a very frustrating thing to hear your mom say when you like know the facts about it. So like
Yeah.
if I'm gonna like share my opinion on what happened on January 6th, and then it would be wrong of me to say, well, you can't share your opinion. So at this point, we just can't share each other's opinions because it will just make me frustrated to hear her viewpoint. So I like sat down and like it was really hard because like most of our conversations, most of my life have been about religion and politics because they love
Yeah.
chatting about that, just the way they raised me. So having to set that boundary and say like we can't talk about this in my life. So once I created that boundary, I was then able to say, and I have this really important thing I want to tell you, but I don't want you can't respond to my news about with your views on religion and like my relationships. So I was like, I want to tell you that I am attracted to women. I'm not attracted to men at all. And that I am currently dating a woman. And my mom was like, it was really funny to watch her absorb it. And then she's like, but you don't, and she said, well, you don't really want me to talk to you about this. Well, I really don't think I can hear about your dating. Like, I don't think I can listen to you talk about who you're dating. And that was fine with me. I'm fine with not telling them who I'm dating and like my relationships. So that we basically mutually set these boundaries. Like she knows I'm dating, but she doesn't want me to tell her. And then when I went through a breakup, I didn't mention it till like 6-7 weeks after. And my mom actually apologized and she was like, I'm really sorry that like I cannot emotionally handle you talking to me about your relationships because like I don't know how to like balance my religious viewpoints and loving you as a person. And she's like, I wish I could, but I don't know how to. And like I understand, like it's like I understand like having a whole life spent in a community that like views like anyone as gay as like an abomination, like that's basically their viewpoint, to suddenly have a child be that and then figuring out how to still love them and still like communicate is like extremely hard. So it's been about a year since I came out to them. And yeah, we're at that point where like they know that I'm dating, but we just choose to not acknowledge, like talk about it at all.
Yeah. I mean that's good that you're okay with that. And I feel like you're like the definition of not being hypocritical because what you're saying is like, okay, so I need to be true to myself and I need to be able to have self-love and ownership of like the way I want to live my life. But that means I also have to respect that they're being true to themselves. And this is how they see their self-love and living their life. So I'm not going to be hateful towards it. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't like it. I don't have to agree with it. I don't have to have conversations with them around it. Them trying to convince me I'm wrong, me trying to convince them they're wrong because unfortunately in
Yeah.
life as we know with anything with religion and politics and sexuality, like you just can't change some people's minds, right?
Yeah. And as long as
And
they're not actively like hurting anyone,
right,
and
right, for sure.
like we had like conversations when the Supreme Court ruled that you couldn't fire someone for being transgender or LGBTQ. Like I mentioned that to my dad, and my dad said, well, and he has changed. Like this is totally different from what he was 15 years ago. He said, well, the Bible does say to live with meekness, and firing someone over their sexuality is not meek. So he's like, so that's probably a good rule. And I like 15 years ago, he would not have said that. So he has grown. He's gotten a lot like as he's like learned to accept his family members that live differently. It's also impacted the way like works with the world. Like he's a lot more gentle with people who he disagrees with religiously and like understanding that not everyone holds his convictions. And I that makes me like my relationship with them is a lot easier. 15 years ago, we could not have been at this point. If it was me
Yeah.
15 years ago at the same spot, we would just really have to have part ways because he was too
Right.
harsh. And but people do mellow with age, so that's the good news. Is people sometimes people will like get better as they get older.
Yeah. So you bring up a good point there because I think it's important for anybody that's listening to the podcast that, I mean, maybe isn't growing up in a cult, but let's say they grew up in a very strict household or they have parents that have very strong values that go against theirs in any way, right? Could be sexuality, could be politics, like, whatever.
Mhm.
So if you can set boundaries, if your parents are open to that or family, whoever it is open to you setting boundaries and you can respect that, then that's fantastic. Go ahead and do that. But if it's toxic and they refuse to respect your boundaries and they keep pushing it and making you feel bad for living your life, then yes, it's time to maybe consider cutting ties and love them from afar. It doesn't mean you don't love somebody, but you don't have to have them in your life
Yes.
if they're
Yeah.
causing you toxicity.
Yeah. And like my brother, because my brother is 11 years older than me, when he was in his 20s, he had to go through that with my parents. He had to go like a whole year where he and them, they just did not talk. And that was really hard on everyone involved because my parents were hurt, he was hurt, but that was the point they were at. And when I was like 12 years old watching that, I was like, maybe that that might happen to me too, like if they disagree with my lifestyle. I was just thinking I was going to go to college. Like I was 12 and like thinking, are they
Yeah.
going to do this when I go to college? But yeah, I'm grateful that I haven't had to do that. That we can mutually respect each other and like live kind of like I live 1,000 miles away from them. It always helps to have distance, but
For
like
sure. For sure.
yeah, it really does. But it's kind of funny. Like they know they can't convince me to like that I'm wrong, and they really have like they know that I'm doing what I believe is right, and
Yeah.
like and I feel like it was a long time to get to that point for them.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. What are your religious beliefs today?
So I'm kind of like a progressive Christian. I'm kind of been looking for an affirming church that's like LGBTQ affirming. I kind of did not do church all of 2020.
Oh,
I
it was
left
hard.
my it
COVID.
was very hard. I left my church in the spring
Mhm.
because it was not affirming, and that was like a really hard thing I had to do for my for for my sake and like my beliefs.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I was literally just talking to my therapist the other day about this, that I felt like I replaced Sunday morning church with watching SNL, which has been a fun like replacement. But I'm now looking for a like congregation that's like in line with my same beliefs. Like I don't believe in like this gets into like the nuances, but I'm much more of a universalist, and like I think like Jesus is like I believe in Jesus, but I don't think that people who don't believe in Jesus automatically go to hell. I don't kind of believe in hell. So I'm looking for a church that's kind of more in line with that, and then like that's totally accepting of like women in ministry and my being a lesbian. So
Hmm. But
yeah.
and that is so hard to find. There is a huge part of the LGBTQ community that believes like you can't be gay and be a Christian. Like you have to
Yeah.
give up your spirituality for your sexuality in a way. And unfortunately, that is because it is hard to find. It's hard to
Yes, it
find
is. Yeah.
people that are religious in any aspect, but still see you as part of that community.
Yes. I mean, it is like the church community has been so toxic for gay people
Yeah.
in so many ways. And so I completely understand people who had nothing to do with church. Like my ex never wanted to walk into a church door. And I was like totally fine with that. I was like, oh, if you don't ever want to do that, then like I'm not gonna like force us to go to church together. Like that's not gonna be a thing we do. Um, but like for me, like my faith saved me in many ways because I dug deeper. Like when my parents are like, this is what God wants you to do, I like dug deeper to be like, I don't think that's what God wants me to do. And like that's how I responded. Now my siblings totally different. My siblings were like, if that's what God wants me to do, then I don't believe in God. And I totally respect like the way they
Yeah.
interact with faith. But for me, faith was like how I survived in many ways and like grounded me. So as an adult, like coming out, I'm like and leaving my church community that wasn't affirming, of like rediscovering what faith does mean to me and why it's important in my life.
Yeah. I do. I think it's totally possible to have both in your life, and I hope with time we will see more of that and more churches that are open and accepting. With all of this from your past, and I obviously you said you go to therapy, but what are the biggest things that have helped you to kind of learn to love yourself and trust your gut instincts versus the way you were brought up?
Oh my goodness. I was just like, I just, someone I follow on Instagram was just talking about that. Like, if you grew up in fundamentalism, you learn to like doubt all of your feelings. And I think for
Mhm.
me, the biggest thing to learning that my feelings were good and valid was when I realized I was a lesbian, because everybody was like, don't listen to your feelings, only listen to what God says. And I said, but that means I will never be happy or fulfilled emotionally. So do I always have to constantly tell myself my feelings are wrong, or do I have to like pursue my feelings and like balance out what progressive Christians view the Bible differently? And I feel like choosing to do that helped me choose my feelings and my like emotions and make honoring myself and my whole self, because that was like a huge step forward for me. And like finding a therapist who is affirming and like who like works specifically for LGBTQ people and like young adults who've like grown up in fundamentalism and like becoming their full like selves, that was extremely helpful. But like that one choice I feel like helped me redefine my like entire life, because until that point I was always like kind of doubting my feelings, like maybe I'm in the wrong, maybe like like my dad would
Yeah.
always say like every Disney movie is like follow your heart, like that's just like a Disney theme. My dad would always like tell us that like that theme was wrong. He's like, you don't follow your heart, you're only supposed to follow what God says. But really what God says was whatever interpretation of the Bible he wanted to like run with in our life.
Right.
So I think following your heart like is like a very trite message, but it's also like honor your emotions, like honor your feelings. And I feel like for me, realizing I was a lesbian and honoring myself in that way and not trying to like tear myself apart in order to follow a strict interpretation of the Bible was like a big moment for me in letting myself know that my feelings were valid and like my journey was a valid journey and was okay to walk.
So that sounds so simple, but I'm assuming it wasn't.
No, it was like I feel like I first started realizing I was gay in November, and I like continued to listen to these podcasts of people who had left fundamentalism and like were spiritual and gay and like Christian and gay. And I didn't tell anyone I was gay until mid-February. So that was like 3 months of like hearing people say that it was okay, like listening to people who had gone through like the same things I had gone through, and had honored their feelings and like followed like their emotions. So like that took some like rethinking. And it was a long time before like I could get to the point of like listening to these people. So yeah, it was quite a long journey. I feel like I started to realize I disagreed with fundamentalism. I feel like a lot of people realize this, but after Donald Trump was elected, and I was like, these values that brought this man into power just don't line up with what I read the Bible and see. So I started looking for more like progressive voices, because the voices I had always grown up with put a man in office who is like the exact opposite of what I had always been taught an elected, like a humble elected official should be. And I was like, if you're supporting this kind of man, then what else are you reading in the Bible wrong? And so like I'm not grateful Donald Trump was elected. Like I don't think that was a good thing. But when it comes to like freeing myself from fundamentalism and like realizing I was grew up in a cult, it was helpful in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. So did you go through like a when you were figuring out your sexuality and like really setting these boundaries, did you have days where you were doing like a lot of self-doubt? Like, am I doing the right thing? Why am I rebelling? Like, why do I think this way? Did you have those moments?
Um, I don't think so, because I'm like an all or
That's
nothing
lucky.
person. So I was like, once I realized I was gay, I was like, I'm never walking back into the closet emotionally. Like I didn't come out for like a long time, like publicly, but emotionally, I was like, I'm never going back to a place where I have to destroy my emotions to be like to follow these rules.
Well, finding that in yourself was probably so like
Yes.
right? So
Yeah.
like why once you feel that sense of like relief that's so freeing, why would you want to turn
Yeah,
back?
like, once I was like, "I'm gay and I still believe in God," like, in that, like, moment of clarity and, like, absolute, like, relief that I was no longer, like, trying to be something I wasn't,
Mhm.
internally, like, this is all internal because 'cause I'm not out publicly at this point, but, like, once I'm internally, like, accepting myself, then I would
Yeah.
never turn my back on my true self again.
It's a really important message. So if you're not there yet, it's time to be true to yourself. Do you hold anything still with your value system today that you grew up in this culture with? Or any of those values still aligned or no?
That's it. I have been told so many times by so many people that I'm like really brave or bold. And honestly, that comes from being in a cult where you're always like, where you think that like your values are better than everyone else's, like, and God wants you to be like an evangelist for Him. And
Mhm.
so to stand up and like be willing to suffer persecution or whatever to like spread the message of this cult or like living this way. And like, I no longer believe in like being persecuted for my beliefs and like I no longer am like trying to be a martyr basically, which is like we were all raised like we're going to be martyrs for Jesus. um that's not in my head, but the value of being like bold and standing for what I believe is still there. So whenever people are like you're so brave and like what in my life and like say like name like telling stories from my childhood or whatnot, that really comes from my childhood because my childhood I was always taught to like stand up for what I believe, to share the truth no matter what, and to like be myself and like as a Christian. And now I'm like myself as a gay lesbian, like who I am today. And that is because I was taught to be bold in that way.
Yeah. That backfired for them, didn't it?
It did. It did.
That's
Yeah.
I've never thought of that though. That's a really good point that like yes, if you are taught to be like this is your truth because that was your truth growing up,
Hmm.
right? So you're like
Yes.
I
Yeah.
am speaking my truth. I am sticking up for my family's values and why that these are the right way to live life and then you realize, wait, those aren't my values. So I'm going to still speak my truth about it. I
Yes.
have
Exactly.
yeah, I've never thought of that. That's an interesting perspective there. Do you have any tools in your tool belt that you want to share with us on like how to do this work of like self-love and discovery?
I wish I had like tools I could like pull out. That sounds like so much
Right?
easier. But yeah, it's a lot of just like realizing, like envisioning the life that you want. Like you don't want to be emotionally like dependent on someone else's approval and like finding out what you need to be emotionally independent, which for me was like going to therapy and like learning to trust and rely on myself and also developing amazing friendships with people who validate me. My friends are like the most amazing people in the world and my friends are the number first people in my life who are like don't talk to your parents, talk to us, so that I don't turn to my parents for emotional validation. Because we all need people in our life who are emotional pillars, and like
Yeah.
learning to not turn to my parents and instead like building friendships I can turn to instead. It's been like incredibly helpful. Um, and then I think journaling has always been helpful. Um, and yeah, like learning to turn to resources like podcasts or books about people who've gone through like really hard things. A couple books that have like been extremely helpful to me. It's a book by the person who survived Westboro Baptist Church, which Westboro is like a Baptist cult basically that they like picket funerals and like they do like awful things. And her grandfather founded Westboro Baptist, and she wrote a book. I'm trying to think of the name of it. I'm gonna look it up real quick. But her book, because her family is in a cult, was like extremely helpful because she grew up almost the same way as me, um, but in a very public way because Westboro is so public. Um, and like learning to not depend on her family, but like finding her voice and herself outside of that. Her book was like absolutely phenomenal. Like it helped me like real like seeing my family through other people's eyes, but like in a different way.
Yeah.
Um, and like relating to her experience.
Yeah. Yeah. So reading books, podcasts, whatever you can do that's going to put you in a position of like, okay, there's
Okay.
hope out there.
Okay. It's Unfollow by Megan Phelps Roger.
All right, perfect.
And I think the thing that like stuck out to me about her story is she's surviving. She's like in Westboro. She's like working for the church, and she had a Twitter account, and she would like engage with people on Twitter to defend like the beliefs of her church. And as she's engaging with people, they like ask her questions, and as she's digging for answers, she realizes her church is wrong. And it just that resonated with me, because I was such a person to like stand up for my parents' beliefs and like constantly like want to defend them. And as I like dug deeper into my faith is when I realized that I disagreed. And like reading her story in a very similar way, I think she's now an atheist, but like she like dug deeper into like truth to like figure out whether or not she agreed with her church and family.
Yeah. There's so much truth in that. I think you hear that a lot, that I hear that a lot in the ex-Mormon community,
Mm-hmm.
that they were very in to their religion. And then because they were so into it, they wanted to know as much as possible. And the more they learned, the more they questioned their religion. And then the more
Yes.
they
Yeah.
questioned their religion, they ended up leaving their religion. And I mean, just, I'm with you. Like, I think to some level, that's a lot of religions, right? I
Yes.
mean,
Yeah.
I think that unfortunately the hierarchy of religion does have more evil in it than people like to talk about. So you have to be careful with that stuff, like the more you dig, the more truths will come out. So that's a good life lesson in general. When there's anything going on in your life and you feel like your gut is telling you something is off, or you're feeling conflicted, learn about
Mm-hmm.
it.
Yes.
Ask the questions and find the answers, because the more we question in life, the more we learn, and the
Yes.
more we get to be true to ourselves.
Yes. That's so true. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a really good takeaway, actually, is like learn to question things that make you feel conflicted.
Yeah. Exactly. And like know what you're defending in a many ways. Like know why you believe what you believe and why you're standing for your community.
Absolutely. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being an open book and coming on and talking with me and sharing your story.
Yeah, it was really fun.